Bismillahi walhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So this is the second session that we have with the collection of Imaam Nawawi, the 40 Hadith. In this section, we wanted to read the third Hadith instead of reading the second Hadith. In the order of the 40 Hadith of Imaam Nawawi, he begins with the Hadith that pertains to a discussion on intentions. And we covered that last week. The Hadith of intention is a foundational Hadith. And he begins with that Hadith. And that Hadith basically is teaching us that all of our actions should be governed by a clear intention. Some of the scholars, they took a principle from this Hadith to talk about all affairs are governed by their objectives or aims or goals or ends. With that Hadith, we learned then that the life of the Muslim is purposeful. The Muslim or the Muslimah is a conscious person, being conscious of why it is that they perform an action and monitoring the level of sincerity that is governing that action or that intention. The third Hadith, it talks about the pillars of Islam. The reason why we're skipping the second Hadith is because it's a little long and it deals with the three dimensions of Islam, or the three dimensions of deen or maratib al-deen, al-Islam, al-Iman, and al-Ihsan, and is known to be the Hadith of Jibreel. It's beneficial to go into the third Hadith prior to going into the Hadith of Jibreel, which defines what Islam is, what Iman is, what Ihsan is. All of those three components together are what we call deen, or the way of life, which is a life of service to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. In the third Hadith, the Hadith is known as the Hadith of the Arkan of Islam, وَدَعِمُهَا الْعِظَامِ. And so in this title, we gain a lot of benefit. When we talk about the pillars of Islam, we usually imagine that which holds it up. And that's true. The pillars of Islam, or the rukn, is that corner piece which holds up in a building. It gives it its form and its strength. When we look at the Hadith of Abi Abdurrahman bin Umar al-Khattab, bin al-Khattab, sorry, I'm a little tired tonight. He says, قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول بني الإسلام على خمس. So here, the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, as it was related by Abu Abdurrahman Abdullah, the son of Umar bin al-Khattab, he said that he heard the Messenger of Allah saying, alayhi salatu wasalam, that Islam is established or built on 5. And so this is something that is very important for us in our reflection on our own lives, in our own struggles with practicing the deen. He says that the first is the shahada, shahadati an la ilaha illallah wa anna Muhammad Rasulullah. That's common knowledge. We know that by common knowledge, that the beginning of the affair, so to speak, of Iman, it pertains to testifying that there's no God other than Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and Muhammad is his messenger. Right? One of the things that's important to understand as a complement to what we already studied in last week's session is that all actions should have an intention. Any act of worship demands an intention. We can't have an act of worship without that action having an intention. that intention has to be governed with seeking to please Allah wa ta'ala. Or another way to say it is يعني العبادات مقصود العبادات, as Imam Izzuddin Abdul Salam says رحمة الله عليه, كلها تقرب إلى الله عز وجل. ويعني التقرب إلى الله عز وجل القرب من جوده وحسانه المختصين بعباده المؤمنين. So here Imam Izzuddin Abdul Salam is saying that the objective of all worship is proximity to Allah wa ta'ala, to His goodness and kindness and His generosity, and to His doing good to us, right? And that is something that is set aside, specified, is something that is particular to those who worship Allah wa ta'ala and they're believers in Tawheed. And that brings us back to the occasion of the Hadith, that the first pillar upon which Islam is based is the testimony of faith, the testimony of Iman. And so then acts of worship, they need an intention, but that intention has to be preceded by belief in Allah and belief in His messenger, because the intention requires two realities. The act of worship requires two realities. The act of worship, it requires that not only that we're intending to worship Allah with sincerity, meaning that we are doing it for the pleasure of Allah with purity of intention, and only Allah is intended by that. Only God is intended by that. We're not seeking partners with Allah. In other words, there's no idolatrous relationship there. There's no intending Allah and worshiping something else. We're not in our intention, we're seeking to show off. So the intention has to be pure, and that's a discussion in itself, the reality of ikhlas or sincerity. But simply put, sincerity in this case means the purity of the intention. And the metaphor for that is when gold is put to the fire purifies the gold of anything that's not part of the gold. And so sincerity is that intention that we have is purified so that it is only intending the pleasure of Allah, nothing else. And so that intention that we have, we should be seeking to worship Allah, but we have to know who Allah is, right? And so the actions of the deen then require of us not only a knowledge of who Allah is, but they require of us a condition of the heart. And so the condition of the heart is that we intend to worship Allah with a sincere intention, and then that intention aligns with the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In other words, worship is not something that we conjure up in Islam. Worship is not something that we make up. We don't give the GPS the route to take. The GPS gives us the route to take. And so the spiritual GPS, when it comes to the route that we take to gain Allah's pleasure, that GPS is the Quran and the prophetic guidance, which is the Sunnah, right? And there's details to that, of course, but in the general sense, that's the reality. And so that we say that Iman is that we believe in Allah, we believe in the oneness of Allah, or belief or faith for simplicity's sake, is that we have a conviction in the oneness of Allah wa ta'ala. In our heart, we're firm in that. We affirm that belief. We confess it with our tongue, and then we verify it with our action. In other words, there's congruity, there's alignment, there's a manifestation that what it is that we say we believe in our heart, we're acting upon it. And that's the most difficult aspect of faith, people. To remove from ourselves what we call a nifaq al-amali, or to remove from ourselves what we call the lack of alignment between what it is that is in our hearts of belief and how it is that we act. Right? And nifaq al-amali, or hypocrisy of action, is not equivalent to disbelief or kufr. We can have incongruity, or we can have lapses between what it is that we believe and what it is that we are acting upon, or how it is that we display ourselves. But the believer has to monitor himself and herself in that regard and correct those lapses, bring into alignment our action with our faith, right? And that's simply put. There, of course, we can express this in better ways, use other terms, but for the sake of simplicity, we're saying it in that way. And so then, one of the first things that keeps our relationship with Allah moving is here is not just saying praying. Here is saying what iqam is salah, to establish the salah itself. And that concept of establishing the prayer, the formal prayer that Muslims make 5 times a day, is something that is, it requires understanding of the prayer itself, and it requires sincerity of intention, but it requires constancy. That's where we struggle. That's where we struggle. The Quran talks about الَّذِينَ يَعْبُدُونَ اللَّهَ عَلَى الْحَرْفِ. In Surah Al-Hajj, it talks about that reality. Those who worship Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala on a conditional relationship. So when things are good, they're good with their relationship with God. When things are bad, then they're falling off. And that's the example that's giving the Quranic example. Sometimes people can have the opposite. When things are bad in their life, then they're seeking from God. And when things are good, they forget about Allah. Either way, the reality of the situation is that life does put us to the test. It does put us to the test. And it does shake us up. So part of the reality of establishing Islam in our lives is that constancy, consistency. And in this case, consistency in the sila. The sila here is the salah or the prayer. The sila is that connection between us and Allah. That's what salah means. And then in the Quran, there's frequent mention of salah and zakat. The zakat is the right of the poor upon us. And so the Quran aligns prayer and tending to the right of the poor. And in this case, to give the poor a portion of our wealth, that's the right of the poor. It's not charity. We confuse this point with charity and the issue of zakat. The zakat is the poor due. It is the obligation that we have to the poor. And we can say the poor and those in need. Right? And so the Quran usually brings those two realities together, salat with zakat. So the hadith is bringing those two realities together, as we find it in the Quran, that the pillars of Islam here that align with each other are prayer and tending to the needs of the poor. Then it's followed up by Hajj al-Bayt, or pilgrimage to the Kaaba. Now the reality is that the pilgrimage to the Kaaba is one of the deepest expressions of commitment to Allah, because it's an abandonment of everything that we're doing and the usage of our wealth to get to the place of worship, which is designated as Mecca, where the house that Ibrahim built to single out the worship of Allah, pure worship of Allah, right? The Hajj itself has certain rules and has certain etiquettes to it that demand of us purity of the heart and demand of us that our actions be aimed towards worshiping God, and that even the usage of our wealth, all of that is a form of striving to purify ourselves. And is also a reminder of death. Is also a reminder of death. And there's no doubt that the hadith brings up, lastly, Sawm Ramadan, or the fast of Ramadan, as being one of the pillars of Islam. And we can say, perhaps, and one of the points of wisdom that we get from the hadith is that without the discipline that comes from fasting, from rejecting our desires, it's almost impossible to remain constant in the other pillars of Islam. The discipline that comes from fasting is the discipline which is necessary to establish the salah, to give the zakat, and to make the hajj. That's one way of looking at it. But in any event, the pillars of Islam here are described as establishing the salah, giving the zakat, making the pilgrimage to the Kaaba, and the fast of Ramadan. This prophetic narration was related in Bukhari and Muslim, meaning that its chain of transmission is sound, And we see from the contents of the prophetic text that the content itself is repetitive of what is in the Quranic teaching. And with that, we end people. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.